We are at stop 1 for the City Sightseeing Tour, which is just behind me. There are 14 stops and it takes roughly an hour to get around. If you do want to have a ride on it, have a look on City Sightseeing's website for the details.
So we're going to head out of the city through the walls here into an area known as Boven. Now, it's comes from the old Scandinavian word for booth or tent, basically. It was a tent city, a kind of shanty town, if you will, back in the day. However, of course, you won't see any evidence of that now. That was mostly burnt down, in fact, by the Scots, and we've had a bit of an up and down relationship with the Scots. You may hear a rumour that it's actually illegal to shoot a Scotsman from the walls of York. It's not true.
Aww.
No, don't try it, basically. Now we're heading onto a road called Gillygate. Now, gate is the old Viking word for street, from the word gata. So if you see a street in York that ends in the word gate, it's a Viking street, and the gates are called bars, as I mentioned earlier on, from the old root word for barrier. So the streets are called gates, the gates are called bars, and the bars of course are called pubs, which confuses absolutely. So if you head down Gillygate, keep an eye out to the right, and in just a moment you'll see something that's a little bit odd. Some of the windows are being bricked up. Now, why would you brick up a perfectly good window? Well, it dates back to the time of the Georgians. The taxman had a plan, you see. I'll tax you based on how many windows you've got. It makes a certain sense, because if you've got a bigger house, you've got more windows and more cash. However, it didn't take people long to work out where you can actually save a bit of money by bricking up a couple of windows. So as you look at some of these windows here, for example, on the upper stories, have been bricked up. That's because, they could pay less tax that way. But the thing is, if you brick up a window or two, you lose daylight. Hence the phrase daylight robbery, which is still in use today. So that's where it comes from. Now you'll see this in other places as well around England, but York having more old buildings than a lot of cities still do. Of course, it's more obvious here. Now, the Church of St Giles is where the street got its name. It's just down the end here would have been where the church would be by the traffic lights. However, now it's the Salvation Army building. The original church was torn down in 1539. And there's also dissolution of the monasteries on the Henry Road. However, it's still an active place of worship, so St Giles probably won't mind too much. And York, in fact, has over 20 church buildings still. We used to have over 40 back in medieval times. So lots of churches you'll see around the city as you go about, many quite old. Looking ahead though, we also have York St John University, one of our two universities in fact. So a bit greedy in that respect, we do have, well, at least one of everything, certainly more than one of most things. So York St John, only founded as a university in 2006, before that was just a college. The other university on the far side of York is called York University. As we go around the corner, we're heading to Lord Mayor's Walk, and our Lord Mayor is in fact able to sit in the House of Lords and make legislation for this country. It's not just an honorary title. So there we go. Now, traditionally, the Lord Mayor of York is only Lord Mayor for a year, but his wife remains a lady forever, so that's very nice for her. Her for the job. So the university there on the left, of course, and the medieval city walls on the right. You see, this is called moat side court because he's been moat all the way around the walls. The earth embankment was added by the Vikings in the year 866 when they invaded, and after that, the medieval walls that you see today were added in the 1200s. Over the top of the walls you see York Minster, the jewel in York's crown you might say. It's the largest Gothic cathedral in the north of Europe, and it took 252 years to build. We finished it in 1472, 20 years before Christopher Columbus set sail for America. Although he was actually looking for a year, he just got lost. The Vikings got there before him anyway. So there we go. However, they say even though it took 252 years, it's never really been finished. They never put a spire on top of the tower. The reason for this is because they were unable to do it. The tower itself weighs 16,000 tons, and the old foundations just couldn't support the weight of the spire. They tried a couple of times, kept falling down, so they decided it was against God's will. Now it's been basically reinforced, and they can actually add a spire if they want to, but it would change the look of the building too much after so many centuries here in York. It's also one of the few cathedrals in York that has its own police force. One of the oldest police forces in England. It predates the Metropolitan Police, in fact. Now we're going to go around the corner to the left in just a minute, and as we do, look to the right and you'll see Monk Bar, the tallest gateway in the city of York. The statues on top are known as the Wild Men of York, and legend has it they will throw their boulders down to defend the city. Of course, they have no defence. But also the building portcullis there that actually works, the only working portcullis there in York. So walk underneath and look at the spikes over your head, but then remember that the mechanism is very, very old. That's what I'll say. Also inside there's a small prison, so if you do get a chance to go inside there, don't get locked in. Now, Richard III actually had the gateway hired, It was actually only the same height as the other gateways before. And he was actually quite a popular monarch here in York, even though it's a controversial choice. You may have seen a play like Shakespeare, "Now is the winter of our discontent." He was portrayed as a villain, but of course Shakespeare was writing to the winning side, but the Tudors of course killed Richard III. He was the last king of the House of York. His dad was Duke of York and his son became Prince of Wales here, young Prince Edward, behind York Minster in the old Bishop Palace. So he had a strong connection to the city and actually wanted to be buried here, he said, after he died. However, he was found in Leicester and sadly has been interred there, so many Yorkshire people were not happy about that. Oh well, we can't win them all. Now we're heading down towards the River Foss, the smaller of York's two rivers. Now having two rivers is both a good thing and a bad thing. It can be good for defence and for trade. Sadly, we do get lots of flooding in York. It's one of the things we're famous for. Not one of the things we want to be famous for, but we are anyway. Every year we have some flooding in York. We had some flooding not so long ago, and we all know that again. But in 2015, the worst flooding that hit York in recent times had its whole road completely under water. You couldn't drive down it. All the flats on the left-hand side had to be completely evacuated. It's also how the Vikings managed to invade us. They sailed up the rivers. So all rivers go to the sea. We thought we were safe here in York. They were such good sailors, the Vikings managed to make all the way up here. On the right we have a car park in a Sainsbury's supermarket in Kite. And when they were building this, they made a rather grim discovery. Hundreds of skeletons into the car park. So what did they do? Well, they called in the archaeologists, of course, and then they called in the chief rabbi because they found out it was a medieval Jewish cemetery. Now the rabbi said, well, the most sensitive thing to do is to leave the bodies where they are. So they reconsecrated the ground and built the car park on top of it. So all the bodies are still there. They estimate there might be 1,000 skeletons in that car park. But if that sounds grim or a bit implausible, don't worry. This is over 500,000, possibly 750,000 skeletons buried underneath the city streets of York. We have 50 cemeteries in medieval times, and the city's been here for nearly 2,000 years. So this is why we're the most haunted city in Europe. Or so they say. You can take that with a pinch of salt if you want to.
That explains the
On the
ghost
right-hand side we have the River Foss again. We're just going over a bridge here. And at the end of the walls, you see here, this is the end of the section that you get on from Monk Bar. Now the reason why the walls end here isn't due to any demolition work at all. In fact, when William the Conqueror came here, 2 years after the Battle of Hastings, he came up here in 1068, he found the city was actually in a bit of a bad state. Lots of buildings were dilapidated, lots of people had left the city with the wars that were going on, and the walls had started to fall down, so he had the walls rebuilt. However, when he got to this section, he didn't bother because he had the river dammed up and created a massive man-made lake in this whole area, stretching for about a mile down the road from here, known as the King's Fish Pool, because it stocked full of fish for his larder, for his table, for his troops and everything. So it became a large fish pool basically. There's also an admirable fence, so nobody can get across this section anyway. However, if you want to walk along the walls, it takes about 2 hours to do the whole circuit, and if you're worried about finding the next section, there's actually a map at each end, which will tell you how to get to the next bit. On the right you've got St Cuthbert's Church. Now the building here is 15th century, but there was an older church here mentioned in the Domesday Book between 1086. Legend has it there's a hidden tunnel going beneath the road over to the next building. If it was ever there though, it has been filled in though. But we have this building here, this wood timber building dating back to 1417 on the left, known as the Black Swan Inn, or the Mucky Look to some locals. This belonged to William Rose, one of our Lord Mayors in fact. He was also the son of the Lord Mayor of London for a short time. Now as we look down here on the left, we've got the building site, which is actually the site of our archaeological dig up to 2012. So we're heading to stop number 6 of this festival for those who want to get off here. Yes. And this is a stop for the Shambles as well, and for a good York centre. From here, of course, you can get also to Fossgate, which is where the Merchant Adventurers Hall is dating back to 1357. But the building you see on the left is much more recent. It's called Stonebow House, and in fact, it was voted the most ugly building in York back in the day, and actually the second most ugly building in England. It's a bit of a carbuncle, as Prince Charles might have called it, architecturally speaking. Take care getting off the bus. Hope you enjoy your day in York. No problem. Now directly ahead there's a much nicer building called St Crux. It's a parish hall nowadays, but it used to be a church on that site. One of the largest churches in York, in fact, with a big Italian-style tower, very ornate, very decorative. Unfortunately, it wasn't very structurally sound. It started to literally fall off, which is quite a worry to the people worshipping the church. So eventually, it was demolished, bit by bit, until eventually all that was left is a small church hall you see today. which is still used occasionally for various church services at Christmas. On the wall there, next to some trucks, you've got a sign saying Whitby Walking Gate, which is the shortest street in York, but it has the longest and silliest name. It starts from where you see the sign, goes just past the newsagents, which you see there, and the patisserie next door, and that's it. That's the entire length of the whole street. And it would have only been as wide as where the bicycles are parked there as well. So it would have been a very short, very narrow street in fact. But beyond that, much more famous street, the Shambles. Now Shambles, of course, very famous, goes back to 1086, which was in a Domesday book, so we know it's been there for over 900 years. It was a street of butchers back in the day, which is where it got its name from. See, there are 25 butcher shops in that one street, and the wooden counters or shelves were known as shammels, in fact, which is where it became shamble over time.
Thank you.
Now you might have heard the phrase, "a bloody shambles." That's because all the blood from the butcher shops was allowed to trickle down the street there, and was only being cleaned at least once a week, perhaps. Now, of course, it wasn't just that. All the contents of the chamber pots and buckets from upstairs were thrown out into the street too. So, as I say, it wasn't cleaned very often, and would have been a rather unpleasant place by modern standards today. Certainly not very hygienic. Would attract all sorts of animals and vermin, which would, of course, spread disease. Which is how, of course, things like the plague get spread. But obviously, we didn't know those things back then. Now, in between the Shambles and Whitby Gate, we have a Snickle Way, we call them. It basically starts here, where the number 1 to 4 news is, runs down to the Shambles. It combines 3 words, snippet, ginnel and alleyway, all meaning the same thing. So it's a bit redundant, but basically one of our local words we like to use. Just past the Terrace Bar on the left, you can get down to Fossgate. Very nice place to go, with lots of independent bars and restaurants. Fancy something to eat or drink later on today. Thankfully all still open now, after this current situation. And then, of course, the Merchant Adventurers Hall, which I mentioned earlier on. Hello, welcome aboard, sir. I'm Nigel. So yeah, the Merchant Adventurers Hall open to the public. Dates back to 1357, and they do quite a nice cup of tea there as well if you fancy going down and look around. Oh, careful, sir. That's it, honestly. So we're going to take a photo of the Shambles as we go past. It'll be on the right in just a moment. It's quite a narrow street. We do say, in fact, that the narrowest point you can reach across and shake hands with the person on the opposite side. It may not strip the two, but they are very narrow, certainly the old 14th century buildings. Ahead of us we have a golden sheep next to Greg's the Baker's. That's the Golden Fleet, very famous pub drink from 1503. It's built for another Lord Mayor, John Peckett in fact. It's said to be the most haunted pub in York. And of course this building here with York Gin inside was owned by the Herbert Bart family. Thomas Herbert Bart, born there in 1606, was the last servant of Charles I. And before he was taken away to be killed, King Charles gave him a gold watch, which is said to have started the tradition of giving a gold watch to somebody when they retire. This road is called Coppergate. It's a Viking street in fact, and quite appropriately down the road to the left, in between the Cafe Nero and the Painter's shop, is the Coppergate Shopping Centre, and that's where the Jorvik Viking Centre is. Because when they were building the foundations for the shopping centre, they covered lots and lots of Viking finds in fact. So they built it directly above a genuine Viking site there, and you actually get to go down to the level of the artwork would be. It's a Viking city is below ground level now, about certainly 6 feet or so below ground level. So we're heading down onto Clifford Street in just a moment, which is a bit of a clue as to where we're going to next. As we go down here, you see the Grand Opera House on the right hand side, which will hopefully open again soon. If you go down the hill, you get down to the river, of course, where you can pick the cruise boats up from. You fancy a river cruise later on, and we have the York Dungeons here too. Now the river, just to tell you how high it gets when it floods, actually flooded the York Dungeons back in 2015. So the river got actually all the way up the hill to where we are. Thankfully it hasn't happened since then, but we always live in dread of these things in York. Very impressive building on the right, it's actually York's Magistrates Court, but they built big in those days, the Victorians did. So this is going to be stop number 7 from Clifford's Tower and the Castle Museum, also the stop for the York Dungeons and the Jorvik Centre, and for many other attractions like the Army Museum, unfortunately to the Hilton, and just behind the Hilton you can go to the Bandolph experience in Fairfax House, which is a nice Georgian town. The Fairfax family were quite involved in the English Civil War, in fact it is quite related to Kate Middleton, whose who was married to Prince William. So there on the hill we have almost all that's left of York's Castle, certainly the most prominent part of the name. It was owned by the Clifford family, hence the name, who were custodians of the castle, and the current building dates back to the time of Henry III, back in 1245 when they first built it there. The original tower was made of wood during the time of William the Conqueror, built in 1068, known as the Great Tower. Hello, welcome aboard. Sadly, that one didn't survive, as most wooden structures in York. It was burnt down during a northern uprising against the forces of William the Conqueror and the Normans there. However, the current building is undergoing restoration. It's been there for a long time, but needs to be replaced. And I see a roof on it, which the first time it's had a roof since 1684 in fact. Now it's used for many different things. It was it was a mint for making coins, it was a prison, it was a seat of government, it's been many different things. But I'd like to say there's a great dramatic story about how it lost its roof. It's actually more of an embarrassing accident, in fact. See, St George's Day came around, there was a massive parade through the centre of York, and the cannons were set off in salute on this occasion. However, the gunpowder was stored in the tower there, and obviously they weren't paying attention, because there was no health and safety legislation back then. That the cannons went off, suddenly there was another loud bang, and bang went the roof, bang went the man's job as well, no doubt was there, in the gas to the place. And since then we've had no roof, up until now. If you look at the various barriers around the sides where the building site is, it will show you what they're doing to the place. It will show you what it looked like before. There even drawings of what it looked like in medieval times, because there's a lot more to the castle than you see now. There's massive walls all the way around, and a big moat around the base as well. So where we are now would have been underwater back in medieval times. Now there's of course many different things that have happened here over the centuries. There was a man known as Robert Ass, he was a lawyer, and he led the pilgrimage of grace after having had the monasteries torn down when he broke away from the Catholic Church. He was very unpopular with a lot of people, certainly the Catholics of course. So Robert Ass led a great pilgrimage down towards London to try and stop them. People joined along the way, tens of thousands of people joined his crusade, and Henry decided to get a bit worried about it, so better do something about this. So when they got eventually halfway down to London, he eventually sent someone to speak to them and say, well look, if you stop what you're doing, the king will listen to what you have to say. If you all go home, no one's going to harm you. This of course was a lie. Henry VIII was not a very forgiving man, and Robert Ass was hung in chains from the walls of the tower, they say, and left there for a year and a day as a form of punishment, and also a warning to other people of what would happen for us if we disobeyed Henry VIII. Now, across the road on the opposite side, we've got the Tower Gardens, a nice place to go and sit and have a drink, of course. Nice coffee shop down there, and watch the world go by. And we have the Castle Museum on the left-hand side there. Hello there. The Castle Museum opens to the public in just a book of slots, of course. Now, this used to be the site of York's prison, and just a warning to all, the building you see directly here in front of us is still York's Crown Court, and the prison cells are still in use, so be very careful. But of course, it's not a prison anymore, hasn't been for a long time. And the museum is a museum of everyday life, it's not a museum of punishment and crime. Of course, you can visit the cells where some of the most famous prisoners were held in York, such as Dick Turpin, so I'll tell you more about later on, of course. But there's a whole Victorian street, which believe it or not was actually carried stone by stone and rebuilt inside there. So it's a whole real street. Real shop, and everything there was actually as it would have been in Victorian times. So even a Victorian school. But you can go inside and see lots and lots of different things there too, and of course we've got the merry-go-round in the centre there. It's quite a nice place to visit too. But of course the Army Museum is behind the bus, next to the Hilton Hotel. If you look behind the Hilton Hotel, you see the tallest spire in York, where St Mary's Church is. Worth going to the Van Gogh experience, there's a lot of art there. And of course the Warwick Centre, which is just behind there as well. From Scotland Warwick, and the dungeon is just down the road too. Hello, welcome aboard. Welcome aboard, I'm Nigel. I think it might have changed drivers. He was Paul, but it might be somebody else now. Maybe changed. Still Paul, excellent, very good, so Paul the driver. Excellent. Now just down from here, of course, the Tower Gardens leads you down to St George's Field. Now that was a popular site for quite a good duel back in the days. Back in the day, even though it was illegal, gentlemen of quality would settle an argument by fighting a duel either with a sword or a pistol, and that's how you basically get things done. However, it was strictly illegal. But it did lead to one of York's more famous ghost stories. The Earl of Stafford there died fighting a duel, but people have still seen him there to this very day. York has many, many ghost stories, of course. I'm sure you'll find out many ghost tours in York coming round this evening. There's even the tale of ghost bus, and what that's like. We also have tales of witches. There was a woman executed here, Mary Bateman from Leeds, in fact. She wasn't actually executed as a witch, though she was known as the Yorkshire Witch, a very famous lady, and they say over 12,000 people came to see her execution. It was a very public form of entertainment back in those days. They'd even sell souvenirs, in fact. So there we go. So we'll be setting off in just a tick anyway. Got somebody else getting on board. Now, one of the more famous, I would say criminals, but some people might say otherwise, was Guy Fawkes, born in York in the year 1570. He went to school here as well, in St Peter's School, which is still there. The only school in England that won't burn Guy Fawkes on top of a bonfire on November the 5th. They don't like to burn their old people, so they say. And what incited him to do what he did? Well, there was a lot of anti-Catholic feeling at the time. A woman called Margaret Clitheroe was executed here in York. York, for example, you may know, of course, she's still here, anyway, inside the bar convent, but her hand is holy though. Which you can actually go see, free of charge, or take it down into the chapel. But Guy Fawkes, yes, very infamous here in York, and we'll tell you a bit more about him as we go round. And if you look at the barriers around us, you can see what it looks like about the scaffolding on there. And there would have been a lot more to the castle. There would have been high walls, higher than the bus that you're on right now. Big moat all the way around as well. We're extended all the way past where we're driving now too. That's a big figure up there on the left hand side. Now the Castle Museum was in fact York's first debtors' prison, purpose built for that reason. So if you were in debt back in the day and you couldn't pay your bills, well, you went straight to prison, don't have to go, don't pay £200 in fact. It would have been very good, of course, if you knew £200 in debt. You couldn't do a balance transfer or anything back in those days. So you stay in jail until your debts are paid off if you have to work. Now looking behind the hedge you can see here a bit of trees on the left side, it's part of the old castle wall did actually survive. Things around the wall, which is very gravestones are there. There's a true visual legend across the motorbike driving out now. Talking of stones, if you look at the Wetherspoons on the left hand side, which is quite new of course, and then you look at the city walls directly in front of us, they're actually made of the same type of limestone. This York City Council now say anything built facing the walls has to be built of that type of stone to blend in. Obviously the other buildings predate that. Now on the right, this tower is called a postern tower, from the same root word as posterior, so it's a rear tower. If you look at the chute, that's for a different type of posterior, it's a toilet chute. So basically the guards on duty would have to answer the call of nature, as you do from time to time, and it would all go down into the moat around the castle, adding a bit of extra freight, I would say, and a bit of extra defence as well, so not to swim across, not easily anyway. Also, if you go to the Tower of London, although their moat has been filled in, the grass is very lush and verdant, which is for the same reason, lots of natural fertilizer. On the left hand side you see a small cemetery for St George's Catholic Church, and down the far end you see a gravestone with a path to it. That's the last resting place of Dick Turpin, who I mentioned earlier on, who was executed in York 7th of April 1739. Actually, ironically, arrested for horseback while he was in the highway. He started out in Essex, and there was nothing like the glamorous gentleman of the road, as you can say that later on. Your first smiling bit, a kiss, no, nothing like that. He was a roughly place. Started with a butcher with Curtis, then a poacher, then a burglar. When the gang he was with were arrested, he went on the run, became a highway robber, robbing coaches around all the south of England. However, that got him into trouble with the law, of course, as it does, and eventually he fled to York and changed his name to John Palmer, which would have gone a lot better for him had he not been involved in some more horse theft crept up here as well. So he's taken away to the race course, and sadly that's the end of Dick Turpin. Or was it? Because actually the body was put on display. People paid a penny a time to come and see it. So he's still taking money on people. Now this is a place called Burnley. It's the longest road inside the city walls and back. After the old Irish quarter of York, it's built to the likes of Bosemorel House, a wood timber building dating back to the 1400s, originally known as Kilmartin Lodging House. Now for 4 pennies you could get a bed there for the night. If you couldn't afford 4 pennies, because not everybody could, more than a day's wage for some people, for 1 penny you'd get a big rope, stretch it tight across the middle of the room, you'd flop across the road. It was known as a penny lead, and that's how you'd sleep for a penny in New York. Fortunately nowadays we have travel lodges for that sort of thing. Now directly ahead we have the big gateway in the whole of England. You have to go to Poland or something like this. It's got the original gatehouse, which is now a coffee shop, and this tunnel here is for little bargain. It's a medieval defensive tunnel. And they've got gates at both ends, and a heavy portcullis at both ends weighing a ton. So basically, if you're trying to get in, you have to hack your way through the wooden gate, So you get through the heavy portcullis, and then you're trapped shoulder to shoulder inside this tunnel. Can't really go very far, and then you can drop things down you, such as stones, boiling liquid, or the contents of a chamber pot. Anything that could, including the kitchen sink, really, basically anything that could to stop you getting in. If you finally made it through the other side, through the other portcullis and the other set of gates, of course by then the army will have very hard to get in. Now this is the most modern section of city walls here on the right hand side. It ain't modern, it's built in the 1400s, so that's modern for you. But if you look at the top, actually it's not all original. The Victorians had demolished part of the city walls and actually rebuilt sections of it here. As you can see, the tops are very even and quite new by York standards. Now outside of the walls, or outside of York, in fact, this county line where the city walls are, which is part of Yorkshire, outside of this wall. The Barbican Centre here on the left will be open again to business fairly soon. I hope it's a place of entertainment anyway, and also you have, of course, the snooker championships here too. You also have the minor bar gates on the right, called Fisher Gate Bar. This has been known as Nout Gate. It was bricked up after a huge rise against taxation. It's now been built. On the right hand side you see this tower, it's a seahorse hotel with a sign there. It doesn't really look like a seahorse though, does it? I didn't know what a seahorse looked like, so we've got the front end of a horse back end of a seesaw. Close enough, I suppose. Now directly ahead we've got the Mecca Bingo. It used to be the old Rialto Cinema. The Beatles played there in '64. Also John Barry, the famous film composer, James Bond theme tune, used to work there playing the organ. If we carried on ahead of the road, there we go to a place called Fulford. And the Battle of Fulford was in 1066, before the Battle of Hastings. Now it was actually very important because we were fighting the Vikings and we lost the battle. So the Vikings tried to retake York in 1066. So we had a rematch of the Battle of Stamford Bridge a few days later. We won that one, so 1-1. However, then we had to go like the Normans, and the French and invaded, we had to march all the way down to Hastings, and we lost that one. But had it not been for the Battle of Fulford, well, history could have been different. We might have won. No French kings on the throne of England after all, so who can say? Now, if you look directly ahead, we're coming to the Mason's Arms pub on the left-hand side. It's a very patriotic pub. We've got the flag of Yorkshire flying there. If you look to the left, you've got the white rose, the red cross, and the white rose there as well. It's a very patriotic English and Yorkshire pub there. We have also the flood barriers here on the left. We've got the River Foss and the River Ouse here, and down the far end, the large glass bridge marks where the main flood barrier is. Now in 2015, the mechanism failed there to literally open the floodgates. It was normally a metaphor. We did it literally and flooded the whole centre of York to save the houses on the opposite side. On the left, we've got St George's Field, and this is where we had our ducking school. It's like a seesaw for that, basically. It can be ducked for many different things. It's associated with witchcraft, but it can be ducked for brewing bad beer, like our beer here in Yorkshire. Also for being a nagging pause and wife. You've got to be careful making eye contact when I say that. Not making acid aspersions. Yes, witches were basically put on the ducking school to get a confession out of them. And we didn't burn them here in York, you'd be glad to know. No. We hung them instead, so slightly more merciful. Down the river cruise boats there on your right hand side. If you want to get on from there. Now we're heading down on the Skeldergate Bridge, one of the 9 bridges, and on the right you've got, this is Bale Hill, where the site of York's second castle was. Nothing remains of it nowadays, unlike Clifford's Tower. It was never rebuilt in stone, it was only rebuilt of wood. So when it started to fall down, we didn't pay for the upkeep of it here. It was there empty, left to fall to ruins. Now heading to an area known as Bishopgate, which leads on to Bishopcourt Road. Now the Archbishop of York is very high in the hierarchy of the church. We've got the monarch at the top, Archbishop of Canterbury at the Archbishop, so obviously very high position there. He lives in Bishopcourt Palace, so it's a nice palace and he's made up a nice built in there. So we're heading onto this road here, Nunnery Lane, formerly known as Baglygate Lane. Now, the city expanded a lot during the Industrial Revolution, of course. New jobs were created, trains brought people here. And one of the major trades in York, even to this day, is chocolate. If you don't believe me, just a minute, we'll sign to prove it. But chocolate is still something very important to the people of York. We have the chocolate factories. This one here on the red sign, brown sign, Rowntree Bar. So Joseph Rowntree was a great benefactor of York. He built a whole village for his workers called New Earswick. Gave them holiday pay, sick pay, things we take for granted, of course. And Rowntree Park was given to the populace as public land as well. We've got Victoria Bar on the right-hand side. It's not a genuine medieval gateway, it's only Victorian. And Queen Victoria herself was invited to come and open the gateway Bar Conference Industry. However, on the right hand side you'll see, as we're going down the stairs there, wait till we stop. On the right you see the top of Micklegate Bar, we're passing by later on. So just keep your eyes peeled to the right as we go over the crossing. But before we get there, you get to the Bar Convent. You see the brown sign there? It's actually the oldest working convent in England. It's been going since 1686. It's still a working convent. The nuns are inside. But if you're looking for people in black and white habits, you won't see them. They wear basically modern clothes these days, most of the time anyway. But there's actually a hidden chapel inside. Because back in the day, it was illegal to be a Catholic. Very dangerous. You'd be imprisoned, even killed for being a Catholic. So inside the hidden chapel, there's 8 separate hidden exits and a priest line. So you could flee in different directions, or the priest could hide underneath the floorboards as well. It also has the hand of a Catholic saint, Margaret Woodrow, executed here in York for hiding Catholic priests. Genuine hands on display, been there since 1586 in fact, the hand. And this allows their own skin and nail on them. Miracles have been said to happen inside there too, such as the appearance of St. Michael himself, who appeared here when the place was being attacked and was fighting off the attacking forces. So there's the Bar Convent Marine Heritage Centre. Now directly ahead you might see, in the artillery, a painting of a large shiny green beetle. That's the tansy beetle, native to York. Very rare these days, they live on the tansy plant which is dying out. So they don't grow that big, so don't worry, it's not going to come and attack the bus or anything like Godzilla. I hasten to add. We also have the punch bowl on the right hand side. Now if you see a pub, that called the punch bowl is a link to the Liberal Party, the forerunners of the Liberal Democrats. Because they used to meet upstairs in pubs and have punch at their meetings rather than drinking anything, all the harder stuff, you know. So they didn't get too tipsy during the meetings. Slightly ironic given the usually the owner of Wetherspoons was called. We'll leave that one there. There we go. So we're setting off in just a minute. We also have the windmill pub directly ahead, and the mill does have its very own windmill, still working today down in Holgate. Does still make flour as well. You go to the local artisan bakers, you go to Eastern. And just on the right you see Micklegate Bar, keep your eyes on that. That's the gateway for royalty when it enters York, historically speaking anyway. But they don't actually ask permission to use this York. It's a self-governing city since 1212, very important city. So even Henry VIII himself left. Now directly ahead of you, the train station of York, built in 1877, the largest one in the world that was first constructed by Thomas Prosser in 1880. Very impressive building. However, the original railway station is inside the city walls. As you can see on the right, you see the big archways, that's where the trains would come and go from the original train station. It was too small, however, eventually, so they had to build a much larger than you see on the left. You may also see different coloured stones at different points, which were conquered by the Germans in 1942. York was one of the key targets of the Baedeker air raid. Basically got the Baedeker tourist guide and decided where to bomb from there. They thought, yes, this is York, we will bomb it. So they did. Although we found out decades later when they had a reunion of Luftwaffe pilots and the RAF pilots, they actually bombed York. Sorry, an obvious target being so big. But they used it as a navigational route, basically, because, it goes off to different points of the cross, north and southwest. And they could use that to find where they were going, being so high. Thankfully the train station did survive, and if you don't blink too hard when you're watching the first ever Harry Potter film, it does double for King's Cross Station. We have the Royal York Hotel, as it was originally called, built the year after the train station opened. So it was built in 1878 by the same architects, built in the same stone as you can tell. Nowadays it's known as the Principal Hotel, but many locals still think of it as the Royal York, of course. And in the gardens of the Principal Hotel, where you have the flags there, they found during the 1990s a Roman cemetery. They had a TV programme called Time Team on Channel 4 with Tony Robinson, the acting presenter, and that was Baldrick from Blackadder. Well, they dug up the gardens there, found a stone sarcophagi, basically. This is obviously exciting. Some people had money to afford that sort of thing back in the day, and the coffins have been sealed shut by mud. So the bodies were so well preserved, they're effectively mummified in fact. And they still had their own hair and teeth and everything, including a lady whose hair was neatly passable as well, passing by last door with her, nearly 2,000 years old. But that's not the only things. Last December, in fact, in the railway station, when they did some work on the floors, they found yet even more Roman bodies. So basically, they're all still here with this living room. However, it's not the only story, of course, because we're here near the train station. And although the Royal York Hotel had no real royal connection other than the name, Queen Victoria came to York by steam engine. Being a foreign, modern Victorian lady, of course. But she wasn't really stopping in York. It wasn't an official visit or anything. She was just on the way to Balmoral. This is just a stop-off along the way. But of course, when people found out she was here, the platforms were lined with people who wanted to meet queen, of course, she had to show her face, and the rings and all that. So we invited her to one of our hotels for a nice afternoon tea. Very good, you might think. However, as it wasn't an official visit, some people, curmudgeonly people, objected to paying for it. And so at the end of the meal, she was presented with the bill. This offended Her Majesty, as you might imagine. She wasn't all yours, and she didn't want to come back to York again. And if you go to the Railway Museum, you'll see her train carriage inside there. It has nice velvet curtains, and allegedly, every time the train passed through York since then, the curtains remained closed. So you have to look at all the huge Yorkshire people. Similar incident happened in Bath. She was walking along, and people were parading past her. Her Majesty, Her Majesty, but somebody whispered, she's a bit shorter and fatter than I thought she'd be. I just got right up her nose, as you might imagine. So those are just two ways you can offend the monarchy if you ever see them. Don't criticise her weight, we're all possible on the road lockdown, and don't ask her to pay for anything because she doesn't even be carrying cash. Which is nice for her. Now, back onto the subject, if you look by the traffic lights, just on the right hand side, you see a small cemetery. Not many gravestones there nowadays, but it was a cholera cemetery. Now, I don't want to dwell on disease being as troubling times you're in right now, but I only mention it because the man who discovered the link between dirty water and cholera was from York. His name was John Snow, but not the guy from Game of Thrones. So the other guy from Channel 4 News, Dr. John Snow, born on North Street, not far from here. He was actually in London when he made the discovery. He was educated and born here in York, so we take a little credit for it. I'd like to give him the credit too, of course. Now, of course, you wouldn't go down to the River Ouse now and dip a cup in it and have a sip. Well, probably anyway, and out and boil it if you would. But he discovered it was the dirty water people were drinking, and found a way around it, of course. They improved the sewage system in London and here in York, saved many lives. Anyway, there's the graveyard as you go past. Now, there's another thing more happier thing to talk about. A nice hotel coming up, even grander than perhaps the principal hotel, just on the right hand side. It's called the Grand Hotel. It's York's only 5-star hotel on the right. Now, up until 2010, it wasn't actually a hotel, believe it or not. It was actually the headquarters of LNER, or GNER, as it became known as well. It was the railway offices there from 1906 to 2008. However, if you want to do a bit of star spotting in York, that's the place to go. Because lots of things are made here in York, films and TV programmes, and lots of people stay there too. In fact, when Ellie Goulding got married at York Minster, a lot of the people attending the wedding stayed there too. On the right, you've got the War Memorial, designed by Edwin Lutyens, who designed the cenotaph down in London. And directly ahead, if you were to go underneath the Low Bridge, you'd go to the Railway Museum. Now, it still remains free to go into it, you just have to book a slot now. The largest railway museum in England, over 100 different exhibits, including the Mallard, the fastest steam engine in the whole world, which could travel at 126 miles an hour, which might not sound fast by modern standards, of course, but their record has never yet been beaten by any steam engine ever. Also, we have a bit of fast stuff for you, the Shinkansen Japanese bullet train. I'll probably mispronounce it, but there's only Japanese people on the bus, so I'll probably get away with that. Now, as we go further ahead, you see the archway there, and directly through the archway, you see a building opposite the Grand. That is now the headquarters of York City Council, but that's where the original railway offices would be, the original railway station, I should say, would have been. There is still a small section of platform and the original guardhouse as well. Now you have the statue of a gentleman here, a man called George Lehman. Didn't get a chance to mention him before, but worth mentioning. Basically, he was former Lord Mayor of York on 3 separate occasions, also Liberal MP for York, and head of the railway station. And he still basically stands there to this day. However, it used to be a different statue, a man called George Hudson, a very similar character, also Lord Mayor of York, who was known as the Railway King. He had a bit of razzmatazz. He was a bit like Richard Branson back in the day. He built the first railway station here in York. But he was holding Bentley cash. Through the walls here, you'll see next to the Grand Hotel, they're not quite so grand, Malmaison that they're building. They haven't quite finished it just yet. A bit behind schedule. Now, Malmaison just means bad house in French, so it's a bit of an odd name for a hotel chain, but I've never quite understood why they chose it. But nevertheless, it'll be open at some point. It's getting a bit closer to completion. I think it was supposed to open last year, but obviously events got away from them, as you can imagine. Now, heading over the bridge here, this is London Bridge, built in 1863 in fact. And then before the bridge, you pay a ferryman to get across. He lived in a small turret called Market Tower just on the left. So the ferryman or woman would sail you across to the opposite side. There's some cemeteries folks doing their tours, of course. And where the tower is here is actually which is a local mask. And that's started here in York. She started as an actress here in York as well, in the medieval mystery plays from York Minster. On the left hand side we've got the museum gardens here, open to the public. Victorian time. We've also got really interesting areas out here, part of the old Roman fortress as well. And directly ahead we have a York Minster again. If you look in the centre of the large window there, you'll see the heart of Yorkshire, so called, just a heart shape made of stone. But they say if you kiss your lover underneath that window, the love will last forever. It's not the first minster we have here, it's not even the second. It's the fifth church that's been on that site. The original going all the way back to the year 627 in fact. So there you go. A lot of history there, so not worth going inside. You can book your tickets actually valid for the whole year, so you can come back to York and you don't have to pay again. Then I said I'd mention Guy Fawkes again, worth mentioning too. It's next to York Minster is St Michael of Belfry Church, where he was baptised in 1570. And just across the road from there is the Guy Fawkes Inn, where allegedly he was born. So, born there, baptised there, quite convenient for him. And then most people say he's actually born on a stone gate, not far from there. But either way, we'll let them have that one. But he wasn't originally a Catholic, he was Protestant when he was first baptised. His mother remarried a Catholic then, and he went to St Peter's School, which was run by people who were former Catholics, who were still secret Catholics of course, and two of the members of the Gunpowder Plot were former pupils there too. So it was a hotbed of Catholic activity here in York. So there we go. So lots of things of course helped light the fire and encouraged him to light the fire and get into the House of Parliament. He was also allegedly witness to the execution of Margaret Whitmore too. So we go down here past St Leonard's Place, we've got the Theatre Royal on the right hand side, which I'm glad to say is open again now, York Main Theatre. Beautiful building. If you look very closely at the top, you'll see the statue of a gentleman up there. That's a statue of William Shakespeare on the roof. It's been keeping watch on the place whilst it's been closed. Because all the world's a stage, and all the people in the plays. And then one of the plays, The Summer of Love, which is a season of plays going on for Antony's Romeo and Juliet. So there we have the King's Manor on the left hand side. We're back to Exhibition Square where the tour starts here and stuff. So we're starting again very shortly. If you wanted to get up here there, of course, nice cafe there. You also got halls who display good ice creams. And if you want a walking tour, we've got the volunteer guides there who do 3 tours right off your head.
That's your tour of York.